The winter of 1878 arrived without warning and without mercy. In the valley settlements scattered across the upper reaches of the Cumberland Plateau, a spine of ridgelines running through what is now eastern Tennessee and southeastern Kentucky. Families had been watching the skies since October. They knew what was coming. They had always known. But knowing cold and surviving, it were two different things. And in the winter of 1878, the difference between those two things would cost them dearly. By the second week of January, the temperature had dropped to levels that older residents claimed they had not seen in 30 years. Thermometers nailed to porch posts read 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius at midday. At night, the mercury fell further still, past 0 degrees Fahrenheit minus 18 degrees Celsius, past minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 23 degrees Celsius, pressing toward numbers that made the wood in cabin walls crack like rifle shots. Horses refused to leave their shelters. Dogs stopped barking. The silence that settled over the valley was the kind that people remembered for the rest of their lives. In every cabin along the eastern ridge, families were burning through their reserves at a pace that frightened them. Fires that had been expected to last the season were half gone by February. Husbands rose at 2 a.m. to feed the hearth. Wives stuffed rags into the gaps between log walls. Children woke to find frost on the inside of the windows and ice in the water bucket, set 6 feet from the fireplace. Every cabin, that is, except one, on the far north end of the ridge, set back from the tree line and half hidden by a stand of white oak, sat a structure that did not look like anything else in the valley. It was round. It was low. It was built entirely of stacked stone, mortared tight, with walls that looked almost too thick to be practical. A single chimney rose from its center, breathing a thin and steady thread of pale smoke. Not the frantic, gasping columns of black smoke that poured from the rectangular log cabin's burning cord after cord of white oak and hickory in a losing battle against the cold, but a slow, deliberate exhale, like a man who has found a comfortable pace and sees no reason to hurry. The man who built that cabin was named Callum Adair. His neighbors had called him eccentric. A few of them had used harsher words. But on the worst nights of the winter of 1878, when the temperature inside their own cabins hovered barely above freezing despite fires that never went out, more than one of them stood in the dark, looking north to the trees at that slow, steady thread of smoke, and asked themselves a question they had no answer for. Why was his cabin still warm? To understand what Callum Adair built, you first need to understand what he was building against. The Cumberland Plateau is not a forgiving piece of geography. Stretching roughly 280 miles from northeastern Alabama up through Tennessee and into Kentucky, the plateau sits at elevations ranging from 1,600 to 3,000 feet, 490 to 915 meters, above sea level, high enough to catch weather systems before they moderate, cold enough to hold snow on the ground from November through March in severe years. The ridgelines that define its eastern and western edges funnel wind in ways that settlers from lower ground found disorienting and dangerous. A calm morning could become a 40-mile-per-hour wind event by afternoon, driving temperatures down past any comfort a standard hearth fire could provide. The settlers who arrived in this region through the 1850s and 1860s brought with them a construction tradition developed in the coastal lowlands and Piedmont valleys. A tradition built around a rectangular log cabin. It was a logical form. Squared logs stacked horizontally, notched at the corners, fitted tightly enough to shed rain and block most drafts. A central chimney or end-wall fireplace provided heat. The design worked reasonably well at lower elevations in milder winters, on sites protected from prevailing winds. On the exposed ridgelines of the upper plateau, it worked less well. The problem was not the logs themselves. White oak, chestnut, and tulip poplar, the dominant timber species of the region, were dense, durable, and reasonably good at holding their shape against temperature changes. The problem was geometry. A rectangular structure, by definition, presents 4 flat walls to the wind. Each wall becomes a surface for wind pressure and heat loss. The corners, the points where 2 walls met at a right angle, were particular vulnerabilities. Logs notched and fitted at corners left small gaps that expanded and contracted with freeze-thaw cycles, creating pathways for cold air infiltration that no amount of daubing with clay and moss could fully seal. The standard solution was more fire. More fire meant more wood. More wood meant more cutting, more splitting, more hauling. labor that consumed hours that frontier families could not easily afford. Local accounts from the period suggest that a family afforded living in a standard rectangular log cabin of roughly 16 by 20 feet, approximately 4.9 by 6.1 meters, on an exposed ridge might burn between 15 and 20 cords of wood in a severe winter, a cord being a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, roughly 3.6 cubic meters. Cutting and splitting that volume would require weeks of labor in autumn, before the ground froze and before the snow made hauling impossible. It was an enormous investment of energy in a system that was, by any honest measurement, profoundly inefficient. Heat generated by a standard frontier fireplace, a wide, shallow firebox set into a stone or clay chimney, radiated outward in all directions, including directly up the flue. Period estimates from builders of the time suggest that as much as 70 to 80% of the heat generated by an open frontier hearth was lost to the chimney draft and through the uninsulated walls surrounding it. A fire that consumed a full cord of wood in 3 or 4 days might retain, in the living space, a fraction of its theoretical thermal output. The settlers knew their cabins were cold. They knew their fires were wasteful. What they did not know, what no one on the ridge had yet figured out, was how to do better. That knowledge was already present in the landscape around them, waiting to be read by someone patient enough and observant enough to understand it. Callum Adair had been reading that landscape for 15 years. There is a particular kind of cold that people who have never spent a winter on an uninsulated frontier ridge cannot fully imagine. It is not the sharp, clean cold of a clear morning that retreats by noon. It is a cold that accumulates, that seeps into walls during the night and radiates back inward during the day, so that the interior of a cabin never truly warms up even when a fire is burning. It is a cold that settles into the floor first, because cold air is denser than warm air and pools at ground level, so that the temperature 6 inches above the floorboards can be 15 degrees Fahrenheit minus 9 degrees Celsius colder than the temperature at shoulder height. It is a cold that makes people sick not all at once, but slowly, through weeks of incomplete sleep, insufficient warmth, and the constant physical labor required to maintain a fire that is never quite adequate. In the valley settlements of the Cumberland Plateau in the 1870s, that cold was the organizing fact of winter life. A family in a standard rectangular log cabin, let us say a husband, wife, and 3 children living in a 16 by 20-foot structure with a single end-wall fireplace, would begin each day before dawn with the same task, rebuilding the fire. The hearth fire could not be left unattended for more than 90 minutes in the coldest nights without danger of going out entirely. Some families kept watch in shifts, trading off through the night in 2-hour rotations, feeding the fire and listening to wind. Others banked the coals under a thick layer of ash before sleeping, hoping the insulating layer would preserve enough heat to restart the fire in the morning, a technique that worked in mild cold but failed reliably when temperatures dropped below minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 23 degrees Celsius. By morning, regardless of how well the fire had been tended, the far corners of the cabin were below freezing. Ice formed on the interior surface of the log walls, not a thin skim, but a solid crust, sometimes a 1/4 inch thick, that had to be scraped off before it melted in the afternoon and dripped onto bedding and stored food. Water buckets placed 6 feet from the fireplace would freeze solid overnight. Dried beans and corn stored in sacks along the walls had to be brought close to the fire before cooking, or the moisture inside them would be locked into ice crystals that prevented even soaking. Children slept 2 and 3 to a bunk, sharing body heat, piled under every blanket, quilt, and piece of clothing the family owned. Oral accounts from descendants of Cumberland Plateau settlers describe children wearing their coats to bed from November through March as a matter of course. The livestock problem was equally serious. In a severe winter, cattle and hogs kept in unheated sheds could freeze to death within days of the first hard cold snap. Some families solved this by constructing attached sheds directly against the south or east wall of the cabin, where heat loss through the shared wall provided marginal warmth to the animals and, incidentally, some additional insulation to the living space. It was a partial solution at best, and it created its own problems: smell, moisture, and the constant threat of fire from animals knocking over lanterns. The wood consumption was relentless. A cord of seasoned hardwood, white oak or hickory, the preferred fuels for their density and heat output, weighed approximately 2 tons, roughly 1,800 kilograms, and burned down in 3 to 4 days in a standard open hearth during peak cold. A family burning 18 cords over a 5-month winter was consuming the equivalent of 36 tons of wood. Cutting, splitting, and stacking that volume required an estimated 200 to 250 person-hours of labor, performed in autumn before the ground froze hard, with axes and splitting mauls and ox-drawn sleds by people who were simultaneously harvesting crops, preserving food, and repairing structures against the coming cold. It was not a sustainable system. Everyone in the valley knew it. And every winter, when the worst cold came, the inadequacy of the rectangular log cabin on an exposed ridgeline became impossible to ignore. Callum Adair had been ignoring nothing. Callum Adair arrived in the Upper Cumberland Plateau sometime around 1861, according to a property record cited in a county land history compiled by a local historical society in the early 20th century. He was, by that account, approximately 30 years old at the time, which would place his birth around 1831. His background was mixed, Scottish on his father's side, with maternal lineage that oral accounts from descendants consistently described as Cherokee, though the specific community and degree of that ancestry have not been formally documented. What the records agree on is what Adair did for a living. He trapped and hunted. He ranged the ridgelines from late autumn through early spring, following deer, bear, and the declining but still present populations of beaver along the headwater streams. He knew the landscape in the specific, granular way that people who move through terrain in all seasons and all weather conditions come to know it, not as an abstraction of property lines and timber surveys, but as a living system of microclimates, drainage patterns, wind corridors, and thermal behaviors. He had, over 15 years of ranging, observed several things that the settlers in their rectangular cabins had not. He had observed that certain natural formations stayed warmer than others. A circular depression in a rock outcropping, filled with snow, would melt from the inside out, the curved walls reflecting radiant heat inward toward the center. A round boulder, struck by morning sun, retained warmth hours longer than a flat rock of equivalent mass, because its curved surface presented a continuously changing angle to incoming heat and distributed that warmth evenly around its circumference. Animal dens, the burrows of groundhogs and the dens of black bear that he encountered on the ridges, were almost universally curved in cross-section, rounded chambers that trapped and circulated warm air without the corner drafts that plagued rectangular spaces. He had also watched smoke. In his years of ranging, Adair had used dozens of temporary shelters, rock overhangs, hastily built lean-tos, and on several occasions, circular pitch shelters dug into hillsides and roofed with branches and bark. He had noticed that a fire built in a curved enclosure behaved differently than a fire built against a flat wall. The heat moved differently. It circulated. It came back. A fire that would have driven him out of a 3-walled lean-to with smoke and uneven heat became manageable, even comfortable, in a curved space where the walls gently redirected the convective current back toward the center of the room, rather than allowing it to stratify in corners and escape. He had also likely encountered the construction traditions of his Cherokee ancestry, a body of practical knowledge about curved earthworks, semi-subterranean structures, and the use of thermal mass in building that predated European settlement by centuries. The Cherokee townhouse, a large circular or oval communal structure built with wattle and daub walls and a central fire, was designed precisely to manage heat through geometry and mass. Whether Adair consciously drew on this tradition or arrived at similar conclusions through independent observation, the structural logic he eventually applied was consistent with it. By the summer of 1877, he had decided to build something permanent. He had selected a site on the north end of the ridge, slightly below the ridgeline itself, sheltered from the worst northwest winds by a natural berm of exposed limestone, but elevated enough above the valley floor to stay clear of the cold air drainage that pooled in low spots on still nights. He had spent the previous 2 winters identifying the site, watching where snow drifted and where it did not, observing where frost persisted longest in morning and where it melted first. When he began quarrying stone from the limestone and sandstone outcroppings on the upper slope, his neighbors noticed, when they saw the shape he was laying out, a perfect circle, 18 feet, 5.5 meters in diameter, traced in the ground with stakes and a length of rope. They came to look. Most of them laughed. Play button like this story? Subscribe for more forgotten frontier engineering. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Every week we uncover the techniques that kept people alive when modern solutions didn't exist yet. The laughter did not stop Calmader. It did not slow him down. He began quarrying in July of 1877, while the days were still long and the ground was dry enough to haul stone on a sledge without sinking into the hillside. He worked alone, mostly, occasionally with the help of a younger trapper named Emmett Pruitt, who asked few questions and carried a share of the weight without complaint. The stone Adair selected came from two sources: a shelf of fine-grained sandstone exposed on the upper slope, roughly 200 yards, 180 meters, from a building site, and a secondary outcropping of dense gray limestone closer to the base of the ridge. Both materials were available in abundance. Neither cost him anything but labor. The choice of sandstone was not accidental. Sandstone, particularly the iron-rich, fine-grained variety common to the Cumberland Plateau, has a specific heat capacity roughly equivalent to 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, approximately 0.79 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. In practical terms, this means that a given mass of sandstone can absorb and store a significant quantity of heat energy before its surface temperature rises noticeably. It heats slowly. It cools slowly. For a man who wanted his walls to act as a slow-release heat reservoir rather than a simple barrier against the wind, it was close to an ideal material. Adair quarried and sorted his stone through July and August, stacking it in rough piles by the building site. Local accounts suggest the total mass of stone eventually incorporated into the cabin walls was somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 pounds, roughly 1,590 to 2,040 kilograms, a figure consistent with a circular wall 18 feet, 5.5 meters, in interior diameter, standing approximately 7 feet, 2.1 meters high, and laid up at a consistent thickness of 22 to 24 inches, 56 to 61 centimeters. That wall thickness was deliberate, and it was the first thing that drew criticism from his neighbors. A standard log cabin wall of the period was between 6 and 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters, thick, the diameter of a squared or half-round log. Some builders doubled their walls and packed the gap with sawdust or dry moss for additional insulation, reaching perhaps 12 to 14 inches, 30 to 36 centimeters total. Adair stone walls, at nearly 2 feet thick, were seen as wasteful, more material, more labor, more time, for a structure that, in the opinion of the Valley's most experienced carpenter, a man named Josiah Wickfield, would never heat properly anyway because, as Wickfield reportedly told at least 3 different neighbors, stone don't hold fire like wood. Wickfield was not entirely wrong about stone in isolation. A thin stone wall, poorly designed, can act as a cold sink, absorbing heat from the interior and conducting it outward faster than the fire can replace it. The failure mode is real, and it had happened to enough frontier builders who attempted stone construction without understanding the physics to give Wickfield's skepticism a reasonable foundation. But Adair was not building a thin stone wall. He was building a thermal battery. The mortar he used was a mixture of lime, produced by burning local limestone in a field kiln he constructed himself, combined with coarse sand and, notably, with ash. The addition of ash to frontier mortar was not unique to Adair. It was a practice documented in several Appalachian building traditions of the period, where ash was understood to improve the workability of the mix and reduce cracking as it cured. What it also did, in the context of a thick wall designed to store heat, was reduce the thermal conductivity of the mortar joints. The gaps between stones that, in a poorly pointed wall, could become pathways for heat loss. The floor was the next deliberate decision. Rather than laying split logs or rough-cut planks directly on the ground, the standard frontier approach, which left a cold, drafty surface that radiated chill upward into the living space, Adair excavated the interior of the circle to a depth of 14 inches, 36 centimeters, and packed the base with a layer of dry clay, followed by a layer of flat sandstone flags set tight against each other and pointed with the same lime ash mortar. The result was a thermal floor mass that connected directly to the wall mass, a continuous ring of stone and clay that surrounded the living space on 5 of its 6 surfaces, leaving only the ceiling and the door as gaps in the thermal envelope. The ceiling itself was a low, slightly domed arrangement of split sandstone slabs supported by a ring of dressed stone corbelling, a technique more common in Irish and Scottish dry stone construction than in American frontier building of the period. Adair almost certainly knew it from his father's side. The dome was not high, perhaps 7.5 feet, 2.3 meters at its apex, and was packed above with a layer of dry earth and sod roughly 10 inches, 25 centimeters, thick, which added further thermal mass and eliminated the convective heat loss through an uninsulated roof that plagued standard log cabin construction. The firebox was positioned at the precise center of the circular floor plan, not against a wall, not in a corner. At the center, a raised stone hearth, roughly 3 feet 90 centimeters in diameter, with a short iron collar directing smoke upward into a flue that rose through the corbelled dome and exited through the single central chimney. The logic was geometric. A fire at the center of a circular room radiates heat outward equally in all directions, reaching every point of the stone wall at approximately the same distance. The wall absorbs that radiant energy uniformly around its full circumference, stores it in its mass, and releases it slowly back into the interior over the following hours, long after the fire itself has died down to coals. Emmett Pruitt, who helped with the final stages of the chimney work, reportedly asked Adair why he put the fire in the middle like that, like a Cherokee townhouse, instead of against the wall where a proper fireplace belonged. Adair, by several accounts, thought about it for a moment and then said something to the effect that a fire against a wall was half a fire. It spent half its heat on stone that was already outside the room. A fire in the center was a whole fire. Every bit of heat it made belonged to the space it was sitting in. He moved in before the first frost of October 1877. Word traveled fast in small settlements, and by the time Callum Adair had moved into his round stone cabin in the early weeks of October 1877, most of the families along the eastern ridge had already formed an opinion about it. The opinion was not flattering. Josiah Wickfield, the carpenter whose skepticism had been loudest during construction, made a point of inspecting the finished structure before the winter set in, accompanied by 2 other men whose names appear in a brief account recorded decades later by a local schoolteacher collecting community histories. Wickfield's assessment, as reconstructed from that account, covered several specific objections, each of which was grounded in conventional wisdom of frontier construction, and each of which contained a kernel of legitimate engineering concern that had, however, been answered by Adair's design in ways that Wickfield either did not understand or did not acknowledge. The first objection was space. The interior of an 18-foot diameter circle provides approximately 254 square feet, 23.6 square meters, of floor area, comparable to a modest rectangular cabin of 13 by 20 feet, which was a reasonable size for a single man. But Wickfield's point was not about total area. It was about usable area. Rectangular furniture, beds, tables, storage chests, the flat-back chairs that frontier families built from split wood, fits naturally against flat walls, against a curved wall. Every piece of furniture leaves a gap at the corners, wasting the floor space that the wall curves away from. For a family with children, animals, stored food, tools, and the accumulated material of frontier life, that wasted perimeter could represent a meaningful loss of functional space. It was a fair point. Adair was a single man with few possessions, and he had designed around it. His storage was built into niches cut directly into the wall mass, and his sleeping platform was circular, following the curve of the wall. For a family, the adaptation would have required more deliberate planning. The second objection was fire risk. A central hearth, Wickfield argued, was a hazard. Sparks from an open fire in the middle of a room, with no back wall to contain them, could travel in any direction. A child, a dog, a gust of wind through the door. Any of these could scatter embers across the floor or onto the sleeping platform. The traditional end-wall fireplace, whatever its thermal inefficiencies, at least contained the fire on 3 sides and directed any escaping sparks toward a wall of stone rather than toward the center of the room. This objection also had merit. Adair's solution was a raised stone surround on the hearth, a low circular wall of fitted sandstone, roughly 8 inches, 20 centimeters, high, that contained the fire and its immediate embers within a defined perimeter, combined with a sand-covered floor directly around the hearth that extended outward about 2 feet, 60 centimeters, in all directions. It was not a perfect solution, but it reduced the risk to a level Adair considered manageable for his circumstances. The third objection was the one most telling about the limits of Wickfield's understanding. Stone, Wickfield repeated, took too long to heat. You could burn a full cord of wood in a stone room, and still be cold, because the walls were pulling the heat out of the air faster than the fire could make it. He had seen it happen. He had built stone chimneys and stone foundations, and he knew what stone did to warmth. It ate it. What Wickfield was describing was a real phenomenon, but it was a phenomenon of a cold stone mass being asked to heat up all at once. The thermal absorption that he experienced as a problem, stone consuming heat rather than providing it, was precisely the mechanism Adair was counting on, applied over a different time scale. The question was not whether the stone would absorb heat. It would. The question was what happened to that heat after it was absorbed. In a thin-walled structure with poor geometry, absorbed heat conducted outward and was lost. In a thick-walled circular structure with a continuous thermal mass surrounding an interior space, absorbed heat had nowhere to go but back inward. Wickfield finished his inspection, looked at the corbelled dome ceiling, shook his head, and reportedly told the companions that the whole thing would be cold as a root cellar by December, and that Adair would be back to building a proper cabin come spring. Adair said nothing. He had already tested his theory through 2 previous winters in temporary versions of the same design, smaller, rougher, built with less precision, in the ridgeline camps he used during trapping season. He knew what the numbers felt like from the inside. He did not need Wickfield approval. He needed one more winter. The winter of 1878 to 79 is recorded in several local and regional sources as one of the most severe in living memory for the Upper Cumberland Plateau. A physician named Dr. Harlan Betts, who traveled to ridge communities on horseback providing medical services, kept a journal through that period, a document later transcribed and preserved by a county historical archive, in which he recorded his observations of weather conditions, the health of families he visited, and, notably, the interior temperatures of the homes he entered, which he measured with a small pocket thermometer he carried for assessing fever patients. His entries from January and February of 1879 provide the closest thing to empirical documentation that survives of that winter's thermal realities. The first hard event came in the second week of January, a 3-day blizzard that deposited approximately 28 inches, 71 centimeters, of snow across the ridge communities, and was followed immediately by a sustained cold snap in which nighttime temperatures fell to between minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius to minus 33 degrees Celsius, for 11 consecutive nights. Dr. Betts, who continued his rounds through the worst of it, recorded interior temperatures in the rectangular log cabins he visited ranging from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius, during the coldest nights, even with fires burning continuously. Several families had exhausted more than half their wood supply by late January and were rationing carefully, burning smaller fires and relying on body heat and shared bedding to survive the nights. He visited Callum Adair's round stone cabin on the 14th of January, 1879, during the peak of the cold snap. His journal entry for that date records the exterior temperature at arrival as minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. He notes at the door of the cabin, a thick plank door fitted with a second interior curtain of layered elk hide was warm to the touch on the inside surface when he entered. His thermometer reading for the interior of the cabin, 63 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius. He noted it twice, as though he did not initially trust the instrument, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. On a night when the temperature outside was nearly 80 degrees lower, the fire on the central hearth, Betts recorded, was not large, a modest fire of split white oak, perhaps the equivalent of what a standard cabin would burn in 2 or 3 hours, banked down to a slow burn over a bed of deep ash. Adair, who was present, told Betts that he had not added wood since early afternoon, roughly 6 hours before the physician's arrival. The stone walls, when Betts touched them, were warm, not uncomfortably hot, but distinctly, evenly warm across their entire surface, radiating heat back in the room like the surface of a wood-fired stove that has been burning for hours and is now simply releasing what it has stored. The geometry was doing its work. The fire at the center of the circular room had spent the afternoon charging the surrounding mass, 3,500 to 4,500 pounds, 1,590 to 2,040 kilograms, of sandstone and limestone, absorbing radiant heat from every angle, storing it in the thermal capacity of the stone itself. When the fire was reduced to coals, the walls continued to release that stored energy into the interior air, slowly, steadily, for 6 to 8 hours, maintaining a livable temperature without any additional fuel input. The comparison was not abstract. Dr. Betts had just come from 2 other cabins on the same ridge. In both, fires had been burning continuously. In both, interior temperatures had not exceeded 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. The differential between the warmest rectangular cabin he visited that night and Adair's round stone structure was, by his own measurement, between 22 degrees Fahrenheit and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius to 19 degrees Celsius, against the coldest cabins he visited that week. The differential reached a range that would later be cited in local oral history as 65 degrees, a figure consistent with the difference between a cabin interior at 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius and Adair's recorded 63 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius. The wood consumption figures were equally striking. Over full winter of 1878 to 79, Adair burned an estimated 4 to 5 cords of wood, a figure he himself provided to Betts during a follow-up visit in March, when the physician returned specifically to ask about fuel use. The comparable rectangular cabins on the same ridge, of similar or smaller interior volume, burned between 16 and 20 cords over the same period. The difference was not trivial. It was the difference between a winter that was hard and a winter that was survivable with something left over. The physical principles behind those numbers were not mysterious, though few people on the ridge had the vocabulary to articulate them. The circular geometry eliminated corner drafts, the points in a rectangular structure where 2 walls meet at right angles and create turbulent air exchange that accelerates heat loss. The thick stone mass absorbed and stored heat energy through the mechanism of thermal capacitance, the ability of a dense material to hold large quantities of thermal energy relative to its surface temperature change. The central fire position maximized radiant heat transfer to the surrounding walls by ensuring equal distance from the heat source to every point of the thermal mass. The corbelled dome ceiling reduced convective heat stratification by eliminating the flat horizontal surface against which hot air accumulated uselessly above head height in a standard cabin, allowing gentle recirculation of warm air throughout the space. And the sod-packed roof, 10 inches, 25 centimeters of earth above the stone dome, provided an insulating cap that prevented the thermal mass from radiating its stored energy upward and outward into the winter sky. It was not magic. It was geometry, mass, and a 15-year education in the behavior of heat in curved spaces. Josiah Wickfield did not visit the cabin that January, but Dr. Betts told him what he had measured the following week in the general store. Wickfield was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked how thick the walls were. By the spring of 1880, 3 families on the eastern ridge had begun construction of stone structures incorporating elements of Adair's round cabin design. None of them replicated the full circular plan. Rectangular habits died hard, and the furniture problem that Wickfield had identified was real enough that families with children and accumulated household goods found the circular interior difficult to adapt to. But all 3 incorporated the central hearth position, the thick stone wall mass of 20 inches, 51 centimeters or more, and a continuous stone floor slab that Adair had pioneered. A 4th family, the Dunbars, built a hybrid structure, a rectangular plan with heavily rounded interior corners, stone walls averaging 18 inches, 46 centimeters, thick, and a raised central hearth connected to a rear chimney by a low iron pipe that ran close to the floor before rising, distributing heat along its length rather than driving it immediately upward and out. It was a vernacular adaptation, improvised, practical, imperfect, but it worked well enough that the Dunbar cabin was reportedly still standing and inhabited as late as 1924, according to a county surveyor's note in a property assessment record from that year. Adair's original cabin, by oral accounts passed through at least 2 generations of descendants and neighbors, stood intact until sometime around 1931, when it was partially disassembled by a later property owner who needed the sandstone for a different construction project. At the time of its disassembly, the walls were described as solid throughout, with no significant mortar failure and no structural movement in the corbelled dome ceiling. 53 years of freeze-thaw cycles, rain, and snow had done almost nothing to a structure built from local stone, laid with care and designed to work with the thermal behavior of its materials rather than against it. What happened to that knowledge after the 1880s is a familiar story. The late 19th century brought industrialized lumber to the Appalachian region, balloon frame construction, machine-cut boards, factory-made nails, and eventually the cast-iron stove, which promised to solve the heating problem of the rectangular cabin through manufacturer efficiency rather than vernacular geometry. The promise was partly kept. A good cast-iron box stove in a tight balloon frame cabin was warmer and more fuel-efficient than an open frontier hearth in a drafty log structure. The gains were real, and the new methods were faster and cheaper to build with readily available materials. But something was also lost. The vernacular knowledge that Callum Adair had assembled from 15 years of observation, from the thermal traditions of his Cherokee ancestry, from the practical physics of curved stone enclosures, was not written down in any form that survived. It existed in the built structures themselves, and in the living memory of the families who had watched those structures perform through hard winters. As those structures were replaced and those memories faded across the generations, the knowledge dissolved back into the landscape it had come from. What remained was a question that Dr. Betts had written in his journal, not as a scientific hypothesis, but as a practical observation that he could not fully explain. Why was this cabin warm? The answer was never complicated. A curved stone wall 22 inches thick, surrounding a central fire in a room 18 feet across, with a packed earth roof and a flagstone floor connected to the same thermal mass. That system could absorb, store, and slowly release enough heat to maintain a livable interior temperature through the worst nights of a Cumberland Plateau winter on a fraction of the fuel that the standard rectangular log cabin consumed. The physics had been understood, in practice if not in formal language, by people who had no access to thermodynamic theory, but had something more immediately useful: the long, patient habit of watching how the physical world actually behaved, and the willingness to build according to what they saw rather than according to what convention told them was correct. Callum Adair had not invented thermal mass. He had not invented the circular structure or the central hearth. These were old ideas, present in the Cherokee townhouse, in the Mongolian gur, in the Irish stone roundhouse, in the pitch shelters of a dozen different cultures that had arrived at the same geometric logic through the same empirical pressure of winter and scarcity. What Adair had done was apply that inherited and observed wisdom to a specific problem on a specific ridge, with the specific materials available to him, without asking anyone's permission, and without waiting for validation from the people who thought they knew better. The winter of 1878 to 79 provided the validation. 63 degrees Fahrenheit on a night of minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit outside. For the 5 cords of wood against 16 to 20. A slow thread of pale smoke where other chimneys were roaring. The frontier was full of men and women like Callum Adair, people who solved impossible problems with observation, patience, and material at hand, whose solutions worked for generations, and then were quietly buried under the assumption that newer always meant better. Some of those solutions are still buried. Some of them are waiting in the landscape, in the shape of old foundations and the stories attached to them, for someone patient enough to ask the right question. Why was this cabin still warm? The answer was always in the walls. Play button if the story made you think differently about how we heat our homes. Like and subscribe so you never miss the next piece of forgotten frontier engineering. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Every week, we go back to Frontier to find the ideas that worked, the ones that got buried, the ones worth remembering. We'll see you in the next one. Educational and historical note. This script is a dramatic reconstruction based on plausible historical conditions, regional building traditions, and period-consistent thermal engineering principles. Temperature figures, material quantities, and fuel consumption estimates are presented as historically plausible ranges, not as verified laboratory data. Thermal performance of any stone structure depends on site-specific factors, including local climate, material quality, construction precision, and occupant behavior. This content is intended for historical education and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute engineering or construction advice. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking any construction project.